Learning how to say no is part of advocating for yourself, because I think for many of us introverted folks who are also extremely hardworking, sometimes we can say yes to too many things. We want to be super helpful. We want to be well-liked. We want to be seen as a team player, that we feel like, gosh, I just have to say yes. And in many ways, sometimes we do have to say yes. Sometimes we don't have a choice, right? Because maybe there's a fire at work we got to help with. But knowing how to be judicious with our time is also how we can advocate for ourselves. So if anything, I want the listeners to remember, in order to advocate for yourself, you got to act, ACCT, at work. You got to ask, circle back, celebrate your wins, and turn down requests.
If you would like to know how to speak up, how to advocate for yourself, and how to do so in a way that feels authentic to your introverted self, then this episode is for you. I interviewed Jessica Chen, who is a global communications expert, best-selling author, and speaker. Jessica has taught over 2 million people how to sharpen their business communication skills. She's worked with organizations such as Google, Microsoft, Mattel, and even the United Nations to teach their teams how to communicate and stand out in a global workspace. Jessica kindly shares many of the frameworks in her new book, Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. In this episode, we talk about her framework for speaking up in a way that feels authentic as a quieter person, her framework for self-advocacy, and different ways to shape your career brand as an introvert. Now, the good news is I did not have this cold when I interviewed Jessica, so you do not need to listen to my nasal tones for the whole 34 minutes. But this was a really great interview, and Jessica has so much value to share. And I know that anyone that is in a position, whether it's your own business, whether it's within an organization where you have to speak up, this is going to be invaluable. So please enjoy the episode. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today. When I saw your book being promoted on LinkedIn by the lovely Melody Wilding, I had to literally run to message you and say, come and talk to me about this. So thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, funnily enough, you are the second former news anchor that I have interviewed for the podcast in the last month.
Wow. I mean,
I know. And she was also an introvert. So her episode has probably been out now, Shirley Engel. But it just really interested me when I was, reading the book and learning more about you, because voice modulation was something that we talked about quite a lot. And I'm a former air traffic controller, so voice modulation was super important to me in the workplace to, sound authoritative. And so, just really serendipitous that this keeps coming around.
That's so funny. Well, I'm excited to share a bit about my background and kind of the communication tips that I talk about as well in the book.
Amazing. So obviously I've done a little intro of you beforehand so people know who you are. But if you want to give us the lowdown, tell us your background, tell us what got you to the book.
Yes, well, my name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the author of the book, Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. And we will certainly dive into the concepts into the book. But as you teased a little bit, my background is in journalism. I was a journalist on television for almost 10 years before I decided to leave and start my own communication agency, which is called Soulcast Media. So now we work with all the big Fortune 500 companies around the world, and we come in and we teach people how to elevate their communication skills. And I'm so proud to say, but I've taught over 2 million people now how to become more confident and effective communicators. So a lot of people ask, well, Jessica, why did you leave journalism to start Soulcast Media? And why did you decide to teach people communication skills? And a huge part of it is because, and I'm completely honest and transparent with this, I struggled. I struggled with speaking up in meetings, sharing my ideas, pitching the thoughts that I had, and advocating for myself. Part of it is because I am naturally an introvert, but I think a part of it, and this is what I talk about in the book, is, I was raised in an environment, a pretty conservative, traditional household, where my parents taught me really to just focus on working hard, being a diligent worker, studying hard, but never did they really influence me in terms of, hey, Jessica, you got to learn how to use your voice, but not in the auditory sense, but in the speaking up sense, in the advocating for yourself sense. And so, as you can imagine, when I first started working on television, which is a very, how should I say this? It's a lot of big personalities. Let's just say that. You quickly feel like, gosh, like, how do I use my voice? How do I speak up and show up in meetings where I don't feel drowned out by other people? And so this question really took me on a years long journey to communications, really. And fortunately, when you are a journalist, you learn a lot about communication. So that's when I decided to take all that I learned as a journalist. And it was perfect timing because I had just won an Emmy Award as well. And that's the biggest award you can win on television. And I was like, you know what? This seems like a great culmination to almost 10 years on news, but let me try to teach all the communication tips that I learned to professionals today.
And do you feel, I think I know the answer to this just from looking at how enthusiastic you are, do you feel lit up by doing that?
I love what I do today because I don't think a lot of us, who struggle with communications, it's not that, we want to always stay on the quieter side, right? I think a lot of us actually have a desire to become more effective communicators because when you can be an effective communicator, now you know when you sit in meetings how to speak up. Now you know when you're pitching an idea to your manager or perhaps asking for a raise, you know exactly how to do it. And not only that, I always find that, once we know the strategies and tips, which we will certainly talk about today, it feels a lot less, how should I say, you feel like there's an ease, I guess, sometimes when you walk into these meetings and instead of being in your mind and being like, well, gosh, should I or shouldn't I say something? It's more like, well, yeah, I will say something and I know exactly how to do it. And suddenly there's that air of confidence. And so I've been able to see that transformation in the work that we do. And it's been so delightful.
Something that I love about the way you approach it, because I think communication can feel quite staid in people are like, oh, I have to follow this formula and I'm going to sound like a robot. And then I'm going to panic because I'm going to forget what order I have to do things in. But you really humanize it in a way that it's like, it is owning your voice and it's getting your message across, but in a sequential way that doesn't feel intimidating.
Exactly. And that's what I talk about in the book. It's not about changing who we are. It's about expanding the person we are. So in many ways, so in the book, I call it quiet culture and loud culture. And it's really about knowing you're not trying to be a quote unquote loud person if that's not your style, because that's certainly not my style. It's really about being tactful and in many ways strategic in how you approach sometimes tricky conversations, right? Because I know for a lot of us introverted folks, a lot of times we can go in this like narrative of our mind of like, well, that's just not who I am, or that's just not my style. But I think when it comes to communication specifically, communications is not a one size fit all model. There are many ways in how we communicate and how we should communicate because ultimately our audience is different. If we're speaking to our senior leaders versus speaking to our team, how we should approach communications, how we should approach our messaging should be different. But again, I think a lot of us aren't taught these things, and I think with this book, Smart Not Loud, it's really for people to feel empowered that they can get noticed for all the right reasons.
It's so true as well, because I hear this so much from my clients oh, I'm just told to speak up more. But what does that even mean? Or, oh, well, I'm told that if I don't speak up more, then I'm probably going to be overlooked for promotion. But what do they actually mean by speaking up more? It's such this intangible thing, like speak up and say what? What I found with a lot of introverts is they only want to speak up when they've got something valuable to say and they feel like it's going to be heard.
And I think that's so powerful because we've certainly all been in meetings where we know it's like maybe 2 or 3 people who tend to dominate the entire conversation. And then when we start listening to what they're saying, we're like, wait a second, does this person really know what they're talking about? But here's the thing, and we know this in research, and we talk about this in the book, but there's such a thing as the Babel hypothesis, right? The Babel hypothesis, for those of you who have not heard that before, is there tends to be this bias of the person who speaks the first, the person who speaks the most, tend to be perceived as leadership material, regardless of the quality of their idea. And I remember when I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that drives me nuts, right? Because I tend to like to listen, process, take in the environment before I say something. But the downside to that, and I will say this, is sometimes because we can get in our head for too long, or we convince ourselves that maybe what we have to say isn't valuable. The problem is then we might not say anything at all. The conversation has moved on, or the meeting is over. And when we talk about accelerating your career, we do have to get really good at using our voice or having people know that we're in this meeting and that we're engaged and that we're participating. Because ultimately, when it comes to workplace visibility, being top of mind is really important.
I resonate so much with that. And I know a lot of people listening will, where you've got this half-life of enthusiasm where you've got something to contribute and you want to formulate it in a way that is structured and valuable. And then, like you say, you take too long and the conversation moves on and it's kind of gone and you're like, oh, it's not really relevant anymore. So you don't get to say it at all. Could you share with us your sequence and the way that you would recommend someone to approach this so that they can speak up in a timely manner while still feeling good about it?
Yes, there's so many communication tips that I can say. But before I jump into one of my favorite frameworks, I do want to say, for many of us introverted folks, we can be very hard on ourselves in terms of making sure we do have the right thing to say, right? And just imagine yourself, in a meeting recently where you wanted to share what was on your mind. And you had this thought, the conversation was flowing, people were talking, you're like, oh yeah, like I do want to say something. But then suddenly you have this, I call it that negative voice in your head that is saying like, well, but Jessica, is that really true? Or is that a silly idea? Or maybe people already know this, right? And that negative voice in your head can cause you to stay silent. But the thing that I want people to always remember is what's valuable to you can also be valuable to, or what you believe is not so valuable in terms of, oh, people know this already, can actually be of value to somebody else. So what I mean by this is what's valuable is subjective, because something that might be intuitive to you, you're like, oh, of course, people must know this. You just saying something in that meeting, maybe you saying that new idea, rephrasing someone's idea, asking a question, calling out assumptions, right? These examples that I'm just saying right now, these are things that are very natural and they come to you easily. But because somebody else is hearing it, perhaps for the first time, we don't know that, right? Suddenly, because you said something, now your voice is heard in that meeting. And even though that was, again, common knowledge to you and what could have easily been like, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't have said something, because somebody heard your voice, now they're like, oh, wow, that was a good idea, right? So what I'm trying to say is don't let all that, self-doubt, that narrative in your head of being like, should I or shouldn't I? It's yes, you should, because even though you might not think it's the most brilliant idea, perhaps to somebody else it might be. So that's kind of like the one thing that I want to say.
I had a client very early on in my business, an entrepreneur client that I was coaching, and she did a very, very specific, she was in a very, very specific niche. She was one of about 30 people in the world that were trained in this specific way of working. And when it came to creating content, she felt really reluctant. And she's like, but it's so obvious. I feel like everyone just knows it. I said, you're one of 30 people in the world that have gone through this training. Like, there's no way everyone knows it. But to her, she lived it, breathed it day in, day out for years. It was so second nature. And she couldn't believe it when people's minds were blown when she talked about it.
Totally. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remind ourselves, and hopefully it'll give, us the confidence to go, well, yes, it does come naturally to me, which is great. That's powerful. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't share it with other people, or that we should assume that other people know that, right? A lot of it is in how you deliver it. So actually I want to go into that I call it the 4A sequence. We'll talk about that. And that is a way of speaking up in meetings that feels a lot more natural. So this is what I talk about specifically in chapter, gosh, I think it's chapter 9 of the book, because I think for many of us, when we want to speak up in a meeting, especially a meeting with a lot of people, it can feel challenging, especially when identifying when's the right time and how do we do it without feeling awkward about it. So the 4A sequence, which is what I talk about in the book, is a way of approaching speaking up. So the 4A stands for 4 A's. And each of these A's is a way of basically formulating it. So the first A is the easiest one, which is active listening. So A for active listening. Because the difference between active listening is passive listening, where we go into that meeting without the intent to speak. There's something about the mind when we know we go into a meeting and we are planning to participate versus be kind of like a bystander or somebody who's just watching and listening. Something about your mind changes when now you're in active listening mode, because what you're now doing is you're identifying the right time, the right place to speak up. And what's right can be that split second pause, knowing that a conversation has flowed to something that you now can contribute. It's you being able to, if anything, I imagine this as like, you sitting up straight in your seat because you now know you're trying to find that moment versus sitting kind of like relaxed in your seat. So the first A is active listening. The second A is acknowledging. So once you have found that perfect moment to chime in, the first thing you want to say is acknowledge the person who just spoke. Oh, Jennifer, that was such an interesting point. Or James, what you just said reminded me of. So in many ways, acknowledging is letting the person who just spoke feel heard. And for many of us, and we know this as humans, people tend to be willing to kind of also step back and hear your thoughts when they themselves feel heard and acknowledged. So as a very strategic communicator, you want to explicitly say that, acknowledge. The third is what I call anchor. Anchoring is where you now repeat just one or two words that person said as a way to connect their thoughts to your thoughts. Oh, so Jasmine, what you said about the data last week reminded me of this idea that I had. Or Jordan, gosh, when you mentioned that podcast that you listened to, it made me think about A, B, and C. So whatever word that they used, just choose one or two. You want to repeat it as a way to anchor your thoughts. This creates kind of like a nice fluidity in the conversation. And then finally, the last is A for answer. Now is when you give your pointed answer of what it is that you want to say. I have found the 4A sequence to be a very nice and structured way of approaching speaking up in meetings, because a lot of times people, like you pointed out earlier, my manager told me just to speak up more, but it's like, how, right? So the 4A sequence is a very strategic way to do that. Active listening, acknowledge, anchor, and answer.
From a visual, I'm a very visual person, I see the visual as a bridge. Because like you say, when people feel like they have to speak up or they do it without being strategic, it can feel like you're just shouting something out and interjecting it. There's no context. It doesn't make sense. With those tips, it feels like it's a bridge from what one person was saying to the next, and it flows really nicely.
It's a bridge. It feels much more frictionless. And it also can give you the confidence to be like, okay, this is how I insert myself into a conversation that feels natural. And in many ways, I call it, quote unquote, like very like diplomatic. It's a very diplomatic way of like chiming into conversations. And the best part is really people will listen, and it works because ultimately what you're doing, which is the second A, it's that acknowledging. And I think it's that acknowledging that gets other people to kind of, like I said, back down, and they're now all ears on you.
And it plays so well to our introvert strengths of being great listeners, because from the get-go, if you're like, all right, I'm going to focus, I'm going to really listen, which does come very, very naturally to us anyway. I think it's just another good example of how you don't have to be different. You don't have to change your personality or the way you are. You need to lean into the parts that you're really good at and then jump on those to be able to get your point across.
Completely. And that's exactly what I mean. And that's what I talk about in the book. It's not about changing who we are. It's taking our strengths and expanding the person we are, and then learning these communication tips. Because once you learn these communication tips, oh my gosh, suddenly you feel like you have this toolbox of like, oh, I know exactly what to do and how to do it.
So I've been having conversations with people in both the legal profession and in academia lately about introverts not advocating for themselves, about very talented, very experienced people either not putting themselves forward for partner or not putting themselves forward for tenure because they don't know how to do it in a way that doesn't sound like they're boasting or doesn't sound like they're full of themselves, which obviously feels really out of integrity for a lot of introverts. But because of that, because they're not putting themselves forwards, they're seeing people that are less well equipped maybe to take those roles, get in those roles, and then they're leaving and going somewhere else. And, you know, these law firms and universities can't understand. They're like, but why did they leave? They didn't put themselves forward for it. I didn't think they were interested. So I would love you to talk a little bit more about self-advocacy and ways that we can start to implement it, because I think it does have this bad rep as like, oh, I'm boasting or I'm, showing off, but it's so essential for our growth.
Oh my gosh, it's so important. I would say the topic of advocating for yourself is probably one of my most popular topics. And it's why I have an entire chapter dedicated, and it's really called Advocating for Yourself. That's actually chapter 6 of the book, because like you pointed out beautifully, it's not something that for many of us comes very naturally because, and I'll speak for myself, I was taught growing up in that very traditional household to not advocate for myself, in the sense of, when you do good work, you don't talk about it. Like, good that you did good work, but you don't want to, put yourself in the front and center. You don't want to talk about it because, yeah, the perception is you're boasting, and ultimately people don't like that. And let's be real, we can tell when people are boasting. But the most important thing, though, is we do have to talk about our work. We do have to advocate for yourself, but how do you find that balance? And especially, how do you do it in a way that feels right? So in chapter 6 of the book, I have what I call the ACT framework. And the ACT framework is a way of approaching advocating for yourself at work. Because when somebody says, oh, you just got to advocate for yourself, it's like, conceptually you understand, but it's, what do you actually do? What do you have to do? And so the way I see it is, I see advocating as 4 things you always have to do to keep in mind. And it's short for ACCT. You can tell I'm an acronym girl, because acronyms, that's
I love all the A's as well. I love the illustration. It's very pleasing to me.
I love it because it's just and by the way, I'm an acronym girl. I'm a Post-it notes girl. So anytime I hear something that's very clever or something that I want to remember, a quote even, I will write it down and I'll put it next to my computer, because that's how I can remember it. So whether it's the 4A sequence or the ACT framework, any of these things that we're talking about today, any of them that resonate with you, write it down so you can remember. Okay, so let's talk about, how do we advocate for ourselves? So the ACT framework is a way of knowing what exactly you have to do. So starting with the first A, advocating for yourself means asking for what you want. You have to ask for what you want, because you cannot assume your manager or your team that they know it's what you want. You may know it deep down that, oh gosh, that could be a good idea. Maybe I should pitch that idea. Or if you're asking for a promotion, you're like, I worked so hard, I deserve that promotion. I should be getting it at my next performance review. But ultimately, you got to ask for it. So that's the first A. The second one is the C, right? It's ACCT. C is now, you got to circle back. You can't assume just asking once is enough. In fact, part of closing a deal, part of getting what you want is getting good and comfortable about how to circle back. And by the way, each of these, I have more specific strategies I can get into. But so you all know right now, the C is circling back. The third one is also a C, ACCT. C stands for now you got to celebrate. Celebrate your wins. This is probably one of my favorite ones because I think for many of us, we are so hardworking. We're brilliant at our jobs. We do good work, but we don't celebrate our wins enough. And celebrating our wins doesn't have to be in this boastful, look at me kind of way. It can be very subtle and simple, where, for example, maybe a client emailed you and was like, hey, really enjoyed working with you on this project. And celebrating your wins can you forwarding that email to your manager with a quick, hey, FYI, really happy to see this. That's celebrating your wins. You're not expecting your manager to say anything, but you're creating visibility for yourself. So your manager, for example, knows that the client is so happy to work with you, right? And then finally, the T is turn down requests. Basically, learning how to say no, because learning how to say no is part of advocating for yourself. Because I think for many of us introverted folks who are also extremely hardworking, sometimes we can say yes to too many things. We want to be super helpful. We want to be well liked. We want to be seen as a team player that we feel like, gosh, I just have to say yes. And in many ways, sometimes we do have to say yes. Sometimes we don't have a choice, right? Because maybe there's a fire at work we got to help with. But knowing how to be judicious with our time is also how we can advocate for ourselves. So if anything, I want the listeners to remember, in order to advocate for yourself, you got to act, ACCT, at work. You got to ask, circle back, celebrate your wins, and turn down requests.
I see so much of the work that I do with my clients in this because, like you say, we don't want to upset people. We care deeply. We want things to be done properly. And sometimes it can feel like, well, I'll just do it because I know that I'll do a good job and I don't have to worry about finding anyone else to do it. But then you're putting yourself in that situation where you're just doing all of the other things rather than the thing that you need to be focusing on.
Exactly. And there's in part 2 of the book, I have a whole chapter on what I call shaping your career brand. So this book, by the way, it's very much a communications book, but it's also a very career-driven book, teaching people how to take control of their career and also the perception people have of them. And so, which is why one of the chapters is all about career brand, because like you just said, sometimes if we can say yes, when we say yes to too many things, the problem with that is, yes, we are seen as a team player, but at the same time, we suddenly find ourselves becoming that yes person where we just keep getting thrown certain kinds of work or certain kinds of projects that, yes, it's easy for us to do and we're happy to help, but suddenly that's now all we're known for. And if we want to really take control of our career, shape our career brand, which is how people see us, how people perceive us, we have to be very clear and strategic with what we say yes to. And so I have this whole other thing in the book about how we can do that, but certainly saying no and what you put out there, for example, even the things you celebrate, that's all shaping the narrative of how people will perceive you.
And for anyone listening that is an entrepreneur, I'm going to say this book is still relevant because for all of those reasons, if you're running a team, especially I'm thinking about clients that have run agencies, etc., it can be really easy, even as the CEO, to get dragged into the minutiae and end up, not delegating things or not being clear about what you're available for. And that's just another drag on our energy.
It's a drag on energy. And if it's not something that you want to be necessarily known for in terms of like, oh yeah, I keep doing this one project and yes, it comes easy to me, but it's not necessarily something that I want to keep doing. Well, something's got to change, right? And so, thinking about how you want to be perceived, how you want people to think of you, it takes strategy. It's not just kind of like going with the flow of things. And certainly there is an element of that. And certainly there are certain things we cannot say no to. But here's another thing. Sometimes if we have no choice and we have to say yes to certain projects, even though we don't want to do it, sometimes you do the project and you do it well, which of course we all know you do, right? But once you're done, it's maybe having that one-on-one conversation with your manager now that the project is completed and say, hey, I'm so happy I was able to help with this. I'm glad the client or, this project, I'm glad everything was wrapped up nicely. But, moving forward, I wanted to share with you that I'm more interested in focusing on X, Y, and Z, right? And now that you have, the quote unquote fire put away, I'm sure your manager, whoever you're talking to, there will be way more receptive to hear what you have to say. Plus, you've built up what I call your credibility jar too. Your credibility jar is essentially where you're doing all that good work and now you're basically cashing it in to ask for what it is that you really want. And I think, again, that's a very strategic approach to how you should think about your career.
Thank you for sharing so generously, because you've really pulled a lot out of the book there to share with us for free. And I know that everyone listening is going to find it super useful. I loved reading it and I loved having you here today. So thank you for your time and your wisdom. But of course, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you, as I do with all of my guests, and especially because you're an introvert, what is one way that you really prioritize owning your energy so that you can keep performing at your best?
Oh my gosh. I think for me, when it comes to work, I really try to protect my calendar in the sense where, gosh, I have a lot of meetings that I know that I have to be scheduled. For me, try to space it out as best as I can. And of course, it's never going to be 100%. But gosh, let me tell you, back-to-back meetings thoroughly drain me out. And I try my best to at least create some buffers in between meetings. And that's what I mean about protecting my calendar, because it's so easy for 30 minutes here and a 30-minute meeting there kind of be stacked back to back. But gosh, it's like, for us introverted folks, that is so exhausting, right? So if I can, I will try to space them out. And just building in those breaks in between meetings allows me to also feel way more energized when I do enter that meeting. Energized and also prepared. So I would just think, for listeners, when you think about your calendar and the meetings that you have to do, how can you perhaps try to space it out? And one of the things that I've also seen people do, which I love, is they'll schedule meetings at the 05 versus the, 00, right? Like, for example, 9:05 versus 9 a.m., because just that 5 minutes in between meetings, something like that can be also very helpful too.
Nice. I love that. Thank you for sharing. And it was great to chat to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight to share a little bit more about the book. And for those of you who are interested in reading it, it's very much a communications book, but it's also a book to help people accelerate their career. Smart, not loud.
And I will drop the link to it and all of your other links in the show notes so people can easily find you on the internet.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. I hope that you're feeling expanded to what's possible for you, motivated to take action, and inspired about how you can start to own your energy. I share even more tools and resources on my Introverts Only email newsletter. By signing up, you not only get early access to the ambitious introvert products and services, but you also get brand new podcast episodes delivered straight to your inbox every Monday, meaning you'll never miss your weekly dose of introvert-friendly inspiration. Sign up now at theambitiousintrovert.com/newsletter or click the link in the show notes. See you next week.